Welcome, everyone. We have the pleasure today of being joined by Anna. Hi, Anna.
Hi, hello.
We're going to be talking not just about our affinity for Anna today, but Affinity Map. So, Anna, we have to talk a little bit about what it actually is and how we define this concept. So, Anna, tell us, what is an Affinity Map?
So Affinity Map is a product of affinity diagramming. Sometimes you hear it as clustering, sometimes affinity concept mapping. There's so many words for the same thing, but essentially it's an artifact of a process of clustering ideas together by a certain principle. So you could be clustering ideas, you could be clustering results from your user test data, or anything really. I've even used affinity mapping for clustering themes around retrospectives. Let's say we have a lot of things to talk about, right? We write them down, we have a lot of disparate notes, but when we try to make sense of data, that's when we bring in affinity diagramming, because it's a really good way of figuring out groupings within data that is qualitative, not quantitative.
Oh, I see. Okay, so let's assume I've gathered a whole bunch of answers to questions that I've asked. And maybe I did that through a survey, or I did it in Observed, or maybe I did a bunch of transcription and now I understand big artifacts.
Or maybe you ideated with your team and you just said, what is the next big thing we should build? And we just dropped a whole bunch of ideas, and there are too many of them for us to make sense of.
Oh, I see. Okay, so this is really first and foremost an organizational exercise. Okay, now I've also heard this term of averaging or late averaging in around clustering. Is that related to this idea of affinity mapping?
It is related, but I try not to bring this complexity because, even the term affinity diagramming, I actually don't like it personally. When I talk to students, I talk about clustering things because it just intuitively makes sense to us. You're not necessarily looking for surface level groupings, like this is apples and this is oranges, right? We're looking to cluster things by meaning. So,
I see.
Yeah, we'll talk about it more when we look at specific examples, but what I'm typically looking for when I'm clustering data is I'm saying, okay, there's a lot of data and I could be grouping it by different ways, but what really makes sense for my project?
Interesting. Well, I love this call out about clustering because then the action is in the word. And the second thing is it's really about grouping meaning, not just superficial descriptions, because when I think in terms around fruit, there might be a construct around nutrition or dietary concerns or fiber or vitamin C or D or whatever it is. However, there's a temptation to just say, well, all apples and oranges and bananas are actually all the same thing. And what you're pushing us to think about is actually it's going to be a lot of anecdotes or references, testimonials, insights that may on the surface not share all the same categorical words or ontologies, but actually could be quite interconnected.
Yeah, exactly. Because, if we wanted to sort something by words that are in those notes, we could just put it into some kind of a quantitative tool, right, and do word analysis. That's not what it's about. We're trying to look for meaning that is hidden there. So, and that meaning is going to come from your project definition itself. So for example, if our project is about better nutrition patterns, we're not going to be looking to sort things by vegetables versus fruit, because that's not really what it's about. We're probably going to look at motivators, why people are not eating healthy, perhaps like financial barriers, those kinds of things. So what I always tell my students when they're clustering data is to say, always bring back your project goals and say, what am I expecting to report back on, or what kinds of findings would resonate? You kind of almost do this exercise in looking into the future and trying to see, you're imagining what your future findings will be. Of course, you don't know what they will be, but you loosely know that there's going to be something about insurance, and there's going to be something about this social resistance, or maybe some kind of like social connections. So imagining those buckets and then going back to the data and doing this back and forth of clustering is a really much better idea than looking for specific words and saying this says apple and this also says apple, so they go together.
I mean, it makes so much sense to hear you say it all out on it, because what I was thinking about is along the nutrition, the kind of the food desert kind of movement that's still very much in focus, we have to think about things like farmers markets and mobility and the cost of gas and technology or technology literacy. And all these concepts have everything to do with actually having a successful outcome, introducing, behavior change around nutrition or dietary concerns, but it wouldn't necessarily be the grouping we would think of a nutrition, like the dairy, the milk, the meat, the fruit that would come together.
Exactly. Or it might not even be necessarily a farmer's market versus the grocery store, because if the lens that we're coming to to this project, if the lens that we're using is affordability, for example, or choice, right? We might talk about like limited choices or expanded choices or sustainable choices, right? And that might be a better lens of grouping than necessarily the places where we shop.
Oh, well, this is really exciting. Okay, well, I know you put together an example for us that was really focused on back pain. So as a reminder to everybody on the template that we're gonna show, the instructions again and again are on the left-hand side, and the video that you're listening to now is found as well embedded on this template. So feel free to watch this again and again as Anand and I walk you through the journey here. I'm gonna move everyone, however, to the upper right-hand corner of the template into the example output, where in this case, Anna has been kind enough to show us a little bit of raw data on the left-hand side, and then a little bit of the after effect, or sort of the post-processing effect on the right-hand side. So first and foremost, my question to you, Anna, is, did I create all this raw data myself? Did we talk about it together? Did I pull it from interviews, primary, secondary research? Like, I mean, where does the base case come from? Where does all the foundational information posted come from before I organize?
And the answer is yes. It could be any of those things. So for example, it could have been answers to a question in your survey, and maybe it was a question where you said, do you have any other comments, right? And it was all narrative and a lot of words, right? And you copied everything and pasted here, and those are your answers. It could have been that you and your team sat down and brainstormed all the different ideas around back pain. It could be that this is data from 5 different tests or interviews with your target population, in which case actually your stickies might be differently colored. Like for participant 1, they could be red, and participant 2, they could be blue, right? So I've seen affinity diagramming used in all of these different contexts, but in the end, where you use it is when you bring all this data in, either create it directly in Miro, or you create it somewhere else, copy and paste it and bring it here. Luckily, Miro has amazing structures for turning raw notes into the sticky notes, which I absolutely love. But once you have the data, then you sort of just make a big bunch of it. Don't worry about how it's organized, and then go to affinity diagramming as a process.
Okay, great. So I love the call out for different colors for maybe different sources or inputs or mediums. Now, I noticed that all these Post-it notes are the same size. Have you ever seen an example where there are bigger Post-it notes versus smaller?
Yeah, 100%. So I do that in my own work, for example, as a user experience researcher. Sometimes when I take notes directly in Miro after a test or an interview, if a participant says something absolutely amazing, let's say they have this like super powerful quote and I want to remember to get back to it, I will just make that Post-it bigger. I will bold it, or I will italicize it, and that will later help me in the synthesis process when I'm affinity diagramming, because it almost tells me there's this theme here, like make sure to pay attention to it. So yes, there's no rules. You can absolutely do anything that helps you, but what's important is that we're working these tools collaboratively. What's important is to set the ground rules with your team.
Yeah, well said, right? Technically, there's endless rules. There's infinity rules.
Exactly, but don't make something bigger and not explain why it's bigger.
Well said. So the idea is, choose your kind of visual language, your design system here, but make it consistent so that everybody understands if we're choosing colors by source or size by emphasis or impact that's there. Now, another question that comes up a lot is, let's say we diverged, as other instructors have thought about in other exercises and templates, and then we come together and we basically have the same note. Maybe it's not verbatim the same words, although it could be if it's only 1 or 2 phrases. But is it okay that we all have the same things in different places, or do I throw out everyone, or is it first in is the person who gets the credit?
Yeah, so if we're using the board in such a way that we're actually ideating in this board and we're creating ideas, for sure we're going to have overlap, which is great, which means alignment, right? When we go to sort this, I usually instruct my teams not to worry about this, right? Just put the related notes together. Sometimes we stack them. We literally put one note on top of another, and they kind of overlap when we make a stack. As long as there's not a nuanced meaning in one of the notes that you want to tease out.
I see.
It's totally okay to break notes, make a copy, duplicate it, and slice it out into 2. Let's say if there are 2 ideas. Also, sometimes one note belongs in 2 different categories.
Well
and
said.
that's also 100% okay, because you don't want to lose that richness.
Yeah, I've actually picked up on that nuance myself. I mean, sometimes it makes sense to cluster, a Galaxy next to an iPhone all underneath the smartphone label. But actually, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to actually separate those, just to your point, if the nuance or the meaning or the underlying intuition was actually quite different philosophically or literally from the other products and services.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Just recently, this happened to me where we're working on this product for pregnancy tools, and we were asking women about their support network. And whenever people would talk about their support networks, let's say they had a mom or a doula or somebody like this, we were really interested in their support networks generally. So we had a whole grouping and subgroupings about support networks, but it also fell under sort of other ways women were assisted. We wanted to know like what kind of informational sources they relied on, and those support people were the informational sources. So that sticky would belong both both in the support networks, but also in information sources. And that's great. We want to retain it. In fact, sometimes what I do, even though affinity diagram kind of drives you to build this hierarchical structure, Miro has really good ways of just drawing dotted line and say like, oh, look, even though these things are not hierarchically connected, let's put a dotted line between these and say, these things are actually related. There's something powerful about it.
Yeah, well said. And you highlight such an important part about digital collaboration, because in the old days, we used to have, dead trees that we wrote on called Post-it notes. Yeah, which I still love. Yeah, it's all nostalgic for every one of us. And we put them on windows or whiteboards, whatever it is, and we would draw all around and then we would erase, but it's become so much more fluid and agile when I having to do that. And I love your emphasis here on, well, a thick line could mean one thing, a dotted line or a dashed line could mean something else. And that's an important consistency to really build the fastest and best ways of working for your own individual team.
100%. And it also allows you to start thinking in models, right? When you see several of these lines, you'll be like, oh my God, what is happening here? There's some kind of a circle. Like maybe we can introduce these relationships and explore them in really deep ways.
Excellent point. I love your point about abstracting the model or the concept as you build, as opposed to having to know it when you start.
Right. Just let the data speak to you. That's what I love about these methods. You come into it and it's a sea of yellow Post-its and they don't mean much. Even maybe sort of in the back of your head, you kind of know what it means. You have your intuitions or biases about what will come out of data. Every single time I go through this exercise, you look at it and you're like, wait a second, because the data speaks to you.
I love that. To become the data whisperer, that's the big takeaway. Okay, so we focused in on the left-hand side, which is raw data. And as we zero in on this raw data, we recognize that this is all around the idea of back pain, right? Back posture and the like. And we see different things like, oh, I don't exercise enough or have enough core strength, to like my chair is actually something I found in a secondhand yard sale and it was good enough and pretty at the time, but it didn't actually have any structural support, to maybe emotional, physical, healthcare, medical related issues, why you can't concentrate, you hunch over like I have a bad habit of doing, or anything in between. That's the before moment, right? This is the brain dump, as you called it, and this is now you're screening and looking at the data. Now on the right-hand side, we now notice that we have processed or used this interesting word called synthesize. What does synthesize really mean to the person who's listening?
Yes, synthesis is another one of those words that's not very well understood and used a lot, unfortunately. So you can think of it as sense making, right? Synthesis is extracting meaning out of data. So here what we're doing, the simple way we're doing this is we're saying, let's group like with like into groupings. I'm even hesitating to use the word categories in this case, right? But groupings. And as we said, groupings not necessarily by apples and oranges, but meaning as it comes to our data. And we don't need to overthink this. Like you can have a visceral feeling, you're like, these two things are related, and you will be allowed to put them together.
Very good.
I might feel differently, and I might pull that sticky note into a different grouping, and that's also totally okay. But behind the scenes, we have this idea of why these things relate.
Okay.
So we're gonna give it a name. So these red stickies you see here, right now, we're giving them a very simple names. We're not overthinking. It's not a sentence.
Okay.
We just say, these things are about fitness, and there's these other things about health.
Okay, so this is kind of labeling our clusters as you described them earlier.
Exactly. And the one behavior that I always like to instill in teams when they're doing this exercise is to allow yourself to overrate each other or give multiple category names. So let's say you want to call it fitness and I want to call this exercise. That's fine. We'll duke it out later. But give yourself permission as long as you agree on color coding and thematics, right? And you say, like, these category names are going to be red Post-its.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely not picking a fight with you on research methodologies and methods, given your depth and expertise. So I think I understand. So we've taken the same yellow Post-it notes we had on our left-hand side and grouped them around this idea like fitness. So we see in fitness, we see things like learned bad exercises, lack of exercise routine, weak back muscles, have weak back muscles. Now, I also noticed that these two Post-it notes are at the bottom. Was that what you were referring to about kind of related concepts that don't really have a difference being smashed together?
You know what? It could be either. Like in this case, yes, they are related. And sometimes you end up with a category with too many Post-its. Like that knowledge category looks too big to me.
Okay.
So oftentimes what we would do is a second pass and say, okay, let's take a look at this knowledge category closer and see, is it really all about knowledge? Like it feels so big, right? Is there maybe something like external information sources versus stuff that we like myths about back pain, for example, could be separated, right? So here it could be an accident. One thing that I really like to do is not to be pedantic about these notes and not have them all perfectly aligned, because there's some freedom and power in moving them. And if it looks messy, it will give you some agency and fun doing this too.
You know, it's an excellent point. In fact, I directly coach the facilitators that we're training not to allow everything to be perfectly plumb and square or organized, because then everyone feels like they're completing a puzzle as opposed to seeking the most powerful insights with the least amount of information that they need, not the maximum.
100%.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I think we've covered some interesting things here. So I've seen how we have groupings and clusters, right, around fitness and health and financial and knowledge. I also noticed here that we have abstracted a layer higher and divided this between kind of internal or sort of self-directed considerations versus external factors like environment. Is that good practice? Is that just one way to do it? How should I think about how abstracted I should be when I organize all this information?
That all depends on the goals of your project. If you're looking for what are the influencers of why people have bad posture, or what are the motivators or barriers for people getting a better posture, right? You don't want to be dealing with 15 different categories. That's too much. Imagine you trying to explain this to your stakeholders, or perhaps you're going to put this in a presentation. Like dealing with 15 to 30 things, you're going to lose people.
Sure.
At some point, you will want to talk in structures. So if you're having too many things and it doesn't quite feel synthesized, and I know I'm using this word feeling, but you will see when you're doing this, I'm sure you've experienced this, when you're going through this process, it is kind of like, it feels like it could use, there's more connections that haven't been made.
Okay.
So in this case, like
that lingering empathy, that contextual awareness you start to build.
Or a team starts arguing, you're like, maybe these things belong together, maybe we should call this category fitness and health. And you're like, wow, that's too big of a category, isn't it? So that's the intuition at which you start developing themes. And you say, well, maybe we keep our individual categories, but we put them all under a theme of internal factors. And then we have external factors. How convenient. Now we can talk about it.
You know, there's actually a really kind of well understood experience or example of this in the consumer packaged goods space, where a really influential consumer packaged goods manufacturer started doing some mapping around one of their antacid pills, so people that could help them with stomach indigestion. And it turns out that as they explored the problem, a lot of the greasy foods that were causing indigestion were happening around board games. Right. And the original way, as you put it, of thinking about only apples and oranges or only linear concepts around indigestion or antacids would have put things like physicians or clinicians or caregiving in and around this ecosystem. But it turns out that board games were actually a more breakthrough moment in the discovery of the research than all of the kind of considered healthcare lens or landscape they were already thinking about.
And that's where the data spoke to you, right? It told you that board games was a thing. Yes, 100%. So here we've gone through from sticky notes that are yellow, right? Our raw data, we categorize them loosely and then we organize them into themes. What also happens sometimes is that you want to rewrite these themes not to be nouns. I like to think about these as statements. Like, what do you want to actually say about this data? Like right now we just labeled it as internal factors, but maybe we want to write a short sentence or two, but like short. And to say, like, these are internal factors that are influencing, those are the internal
or things
reasons.
I do to myself.
Things I do to myself.
Right. Things that happen
but
to
say
me.
something about it, like the so what. You know, this is the what, and then you want to do the so what. And those green stickies, the higher level, is a really good place to start. And it also drives alignment on the team. It's like, why did we sort these this way?
Yeah, well, I love how you're teaching us all to humanize this a bit and also put it in action, right? Start to lean that momentum in, because the data and the insights are only as good as you can actually take action on them, right? Okay, let's move ahead on to our kind of other areas of this piece. And you'll notice now that we actually have, you know, kind of 4 separate maps. Is this one of those exercises which we should do it independently and come together? Is this we should be in small teams like Anna and Adam? Should we be in a group first? You know, any recommendations, best practices here?
Yeah, so I like doing the actual affinity mapping together as a team. Because most of the time, the reason you're doing affinity mapping is because you're trying to drive alignment among the team and develop a shared understanding of the data. There are cases where it is useful to do this separately, however. For example, if the data is quite complex and we are explicitly looking at how do different people think about this data, sometimes we actually take this exercise to our users and say, hey, you sort this and you show me how you think.
You build the ontology or the wrappings.
Right, exactly. This is starting to step on a different method, which is called card sorting.
Sure.
And the two methods are quite similar, but that's an example where we might want to develop multiple affinity groups in a way that we don't dictate what the categories are and see if there's an alignment or perhaps lack of alignment between how different people think about it and why.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think you've given us a really whirlwind tour, but an all-inclusive tour of this idea around affinity mapping. So again, as a reminder to everybody else, please make sure to watch this video as many times as it's helpful. And I would love to hear your feedback, your comments, and your ways to improve. Start at any time. Remember that you can do this as an individual, as a group, for a personal passion project, or for a very professional setting. Regardless of what you do, good luck, and thanks so much, Anna, for guiding us through this journey.
Thank you, Adam.